Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we bring you a chilling and twisted tale, one of betrayal, deception, and a deadly obsession. This is the story of lottery win turns deadly. A tale of greed, calculated violence, and the destructive power of a life-changing win. This case will leave you wondering, what happens when the line between luck and fate blurs? And how far will people go when fortune seems to be in their hands? Stay with us as we unravel the dark and tragic story of lottery win turns deadly, betrayal, greed, and a fight for custody. Lena's life had been forever changed the moment she won the lottery, but nothing could have prepared her for the chaos that followed. From Frank's relentless legal threats to Nora's shocking betrayal, Lena found herself trapped in a nightmare where the people she trusted most turned on her. As the battle for her children's custody escalates, Lena must confront the dark truth. The real price of her fortune isn't just the money, it's the people who would stop at nothing to take it from her. Can Lena protect everything she holds dear, or will greed and deception destroy her life? Lena Matthews had lived in Riverton her entire life. It was the kind of town where everyone knew your name, your business, and your struggles. The same faces filled the small diner where Lena worked, day after day, serving coffee to locals who had grown accustomed to seeing her behind the counter. At 32, she had already endured more than most people her age. A divorce that left her with 2 young children and a mountain of debt, a job that barely paid enough to cover the bills. Her life felt like an endless cycle of hard work and disappointment. Lena had never been one to dream of luxury or wealth. She didn't fantasize about expensive vacations or designer clothes. She only dreamed of something simpler, a life without constant financial worry. The bills piled up faster than she could pay them, and the stress of trying to keep her family afloat weighed on her daily. Yet, she didn't complain. She pressed on, putting on a brave face for her children, who were the only source of light in her otherwise gray world. It was on one of those late evenings, after finishing yet another double shift, that Lena found herself at the local gas station. She wasn't in a hurry, but she felt tired, drained. Her feet ached, and she just wanted to go home. But as she approached the counter, something in the bright, flashing lottery display caught her attention. It wasn't the first time she had noticed the sign. The jackpot was unusually high that week, something like $30 million. But she had never bought a ticket before. In fact, the idea of playing the lottery had always seemed a bit foolish to her, an unrealistic hope for the desperate. But that night, she did something she hadn't expected. Without thinking, she reached for a ticket, her fingers brushing against the colorful paper, as if it was an impulse she couldn't control. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe something inside her believed that just once she could take a chance. She purchased the ticket, slipping it into her bag without giving it much thought. It was just a ticket, after all. A few dollars spent on a fleeting fantasy. The next few days were a blur. Lena had forgotten about the ticket entirely as she focused on her work and the endless cycle of daily life. The demands of being a mother and a provider consumed her, leaving little room for anything else. But a week later, everything changed. It was a quiet morning when the announcement came. Lena was just getting ready for another shift when a news report flashed on her phone. The lottery numbers were called, and for some strange reason, she checked her ticket. Her eyes scanned the numbers, and then, slowly, they locked onto the matching digits. The same sequence of numbers that had appeared on her ticket. The realization hit her with a slow, sinking feeling. She blinked, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. She double-checked, then triple-checked. It was impossible, but the numbers matched. Lena Matthews had just won $30 million. For a moment, she stood frozen, as if time itself had paused to acknowledge the enormity of what had just happened. Her heart raced as disbelief clouded her mind. She had never imagined something like this could happen to her. She had heard the stories, people winning the lottery, and their lives changing in an instant, but they always seemed so distant, so far removed from her reality. But now, it was her reality. She had won. The first person Lena called was her mother, but the words barely left her lips before her voice cracked. It was hard to explain. How do you explain the sudden surge of emotions that overwhelm you when your life takes a turn you never saw coming? How do you put into words the sheer weight of $1 million prize? Her mother's reaction was exactly what Lena had hoped for: shock, joy, and disbelief, but the feeling of victory was fleeting. The questions began immediately: what would she do with the money? How would she handle this change? The town of Riverton was quick to learn of her newfound fortune. It was all anyone could talk about. Everywhere Lena went, she could feel the eyes of the town on her, some filled with admiration, others with envy. People who had never paid her much attention before now treated her like royalty. They congratulated her, praised her, even offered advice on how to spend the money wisely. But beneath the smiles, there was something more sinister. Lena could feel it: the change in the way people looked at her, the way they suddenly viewed her as a source of potential wealth. But the most unsettling change came from her ex-husband, Frank. Lena had always known Frank's manipulative nature. Even after their divorce, he hadn't let go of the control he tried to maintain over her life. Now, with millions of dollars in play, Frank's true colors began to show. His calls became more frequent, his demands more persistent. He wanted his share, and he wasn't shy about expressing his expectations. But Lena, having fought so hard for her independence, wasn't about to let him back into her life so easily. What Lena didn't realize yet, however, was that Frank wasn't the only one who saw this windfall as an opportunity. Her childhood friend, Nora, who had always been quiet and reserved, was starting to change. As the news of Lena's win spread, Nora's behavior shifted. She started reaching out more, offering to help Lena with her newfound wealth. But something about her demeanor felt off, like she wasn't just interested in being a supportive friend. Nora's fixation on the money grew stronger by the day, and Lena couldn't help but feel a subtle shift in their friendship, a growing tension that, at the time, she couldn't fully comprehend. What seemed like a dream come true for Lena was quickly becoming something far darker. The people in her life, those she had trusted, were beginning to see her fortune as theirs to claim. And as the pressure mounted, Lena would soon discover that not everyone who smiled at her was happy for her success. Some were plotting, scheming, and waiting for the perfect moment to make their move. But Lena had no idea that her life was about to spiral into a nightmare she never could have imagined. The ticket that had promised her a new beginning would soon become the key to her undoing. A week after Lena Matthews' life-changing lottery win, the town of Riverton had become a place of constant whispers and side glances. What had once been a sleepy, quiet community now buzzed with the news of Lena's $30 million prize. At first, the attention was exhilarating. Lena found herself at the center of conversations, treated with a mix of admiration and curiosity by neighbors and strangers alike. She had become the face of an unbelievable success story, the woman who had gone from scraping by to being one of the wealthiest people in the county. But beneath the surface of this newfound attention, things began to shift in ways Lena hadn't anticipated. The very people who had once ignored her now sought her out, offering unsolicited advice on how to manage the fortune that had unexpectedly fallen into her lap. They offered congratulations, of course, but there was an undercurrent of something else: an expectation, a sense of entitlement. Lena had always been generous, always quick to lend a hand when she could, but now it felt like everyone around her suddenly expected something in return. Nora would frequently bring up the idea of sharing the wealth, suggesting that Lena put a portion of the money into joint ventures, perhaps even handing over some of the prize for safekeeping or investment. At first, Lena brushed it off, thinking it was just Nora being overly cautious. But as the weeks passed, the pressure became harder to ignore. Nora began to act more possessive, as though the win was something they both shared rather than something Lena had earned on her own. Lena started to feel the weight of these constant demands, and as much as she tried to brush them aside, they lingered. She had worked so hard to build a life for herself and her children, and the thought of losing control over it all, because of someone else's desires, was frightening. The tension between Lena's newfound wealth and her relationships began to grow. What was once a dream come true was rapidly becoming a source of conflict and stress. But the cracks in her once safe world weren't just confined to Frank and Nora. There were others, too, people Lena had once trusted, who now seemed more interested in her money than her well-being. The invitations, the offers to help, all felt like they were motivated by something darker. In those first few weeks, Lena was overwhelmed, unsure who she could trust. She tried to keep things close, to maintain her privacy and guard her children from the growing attention. But it seemed like the more she tried to hold on to her life as it was, the more it slipped through her fingers. Her ex-husband Frank's demands escalated. At first they were vague threats, but soon they became more specific. He wanted a large sum of money to secure their future, as he put it, or he would take her to court for a larger share of custody. Frank knew how to play the game, how to manipulate Lena's emotions, and he wasn't above using their children as leverage. The thought of him gaining more control over her children terrified her, and it was that fear that made her hesitate. Nora, meanwhile, had become a constant presence. She would show up unannounced at Lena's house, claiming she was just checking in. Her conversations always seemed to return to the topic of money, how best to handle it, how to make the most of it. She had grown bolder in her suggestions, even asking Lena outright if she planned to share the winnings with her. Lena had always viewed Nora as a friend, someone who would never cross a line. But there was something about Nora's obsession with the money that made Lena uneasy. It wasn't just friendship, it was something more. Lena didn't want to believe it, but deep down she could feel the change in the air. She began to distance herself from Nora, spending more time alone with her children and less time in the presence of people who seemed to want something from her. But no matter how much Lena tried to keep her distance, Nora's presence loomed large. Lena couldn't shake the feeling that Nora wasn't just interested in her well-being, she had a hidden agenda, one that would soon become all too clear. As the weeks went by, Lena's life grew more complicated. As Lena's newfound fortune began to settle into her life, the weight of it became more burdensome than she had ever imagined. What started as an unexpected blessing was quickly turning into an unmanageable curse. The phone calls and messages from people she hadn't heard from in years became a daily occurrence. Everyone wanted a piece of her success, whether it was for investment opportunities, personal loans, or even more bizarre requests, like helping to start businesses. It seemed like every day brought new pressure, and Lena, already struggling with the complexities of managing her wealth, was becoming increasingly overwhelmed. The worst part wasn't the strangers, though, but the people she had once trusted. Her ex-husband, Frank, had been relentless. Every time they spoke, he was quick to remind her of their shared history, of the things he had done for her and their children. But as the weeks passed, his tone grew more demanding. He wasn't just asking for a fair share anymore. He made it clear that he believed he was entitled to a significant portion of her winnings, claiming that the money could secure the kids' future, and that he had every right to fight for it. Lena felt the familiar anxiety creep in. She had already been a victim of Frank's manipulation for years, and now his attempts to use their children as pawns were even more evident. He wasn't interested in doing what was best for them, he just wanted control and the money. It wasn't long before Lena realized that Nora wasn't offering advice as a friend, she was making moves to entangle herself in Lena's wealth. The more Nora pushed, the more Lena recoiled, but every time she attempted to put some distance between them, Nora would make another move, subtly making Lena feel guilty or responsible for her mounting problems. But the deeper Lena dug into Nora's suggestions, the more she uncovered a troubling reality. Nora's financial troubles were more severe than Lena had ever known. It turned out that Nora had accumulated a significant amount of debt over the years, and the pressure of those financial burdens had driven her to look for ways to resolve them. The realization hit Lena like a punch to the stomach. The quiet, reserved woman she had always trusted wasn't just looking for help, she was hoping to use Lena's wealth to save herself from the very debts that had been spiraling out of control. This was no longer about friendship, it was about Nora's desperation. As Lena started to pull away from Nora, the situation began to spiral. Nora's obsession turned dangerous. She started watching Lena more closely, tracking her movements and behaviors in a way that felt suffocating. Lena couldn't shake the feeling that Nora was always lurking, always looking for an opportunity to get closer to the money she believed was hers by right. It wasn't just about friendship anymore, it was about control, and Nora had become fixated on it. The more Lena tried to distance herself from Nora, the more she realized how trapped she felt. Every time she tried to set boundaries, Nora's responses were manipulative, twisting Lena's good nature against her. Nora acted like she was only trying to help, but Lena couldn't ignore the growing tension in their interactions. And Frank, too, had grown more aggressive in his demands. He had started to threaten legal action, insisting that if Lena didn't comply with his requests, he would take her to court. He claimed that the children deserved the best, and he was willing to fight for full custody if Lena didn't share her wealth with him. The subtle threats about their kids felt like a constant weight on Lena's shoulders. No matter how much she wanted to ignore Frank's manipulation, his threats always lingered in the back of her mind, clouding her every decision. Lena's anxiety grew. She had always known that her ex-husband was toxic, but now, with the money in play, it seemed like he would stop at nothing to get his way. Meanwhile, Nora's obsession with the wealth had taken on a more sinister tone, and Lena was beginning to see that Nora's intentions were far from innocent. The woman she had once called a friend was now a predator, circling, waiting for an opportunity to pounce. And yet, despite all the signs, Lena couldn't bring herself to confront Nora directly. She wasn't ready to believe that someone so close to her could turn on her. It was easier to ignore the mounting tension than face the ugly reality of what was happening. But in the quiet moments when Lena was alone, the truth began to settle in. Her life, once simple and predictable, had been irrevocably altered. The money had brought out something darker in the people she trusted most. The dream of financial freedom was slipping away, replaced by a nightmare of manipulation and greed. What Lena didn't know yet was that the true cost of her winnings was still to come. Nora and Frank weren't the only ones who had designs on her wealth, and soon Lena would be faced with a terrible realization. The more she fought to keep her money, the more she would lose in the process. The worst part was that Frank's threats had started to take root in her mind. Lena couldn't shake the fear that he would somehow find a way to win. The idea of losing her children was her greatest fear, and Frank knew how to exploit that fear to get what he wanted. He had always been able to make her feel small, unworthy, and inadequate. And now, with the lottery money on the line, he had all the leverage he needed. Lena felt trapped, as though every move she made was being watched, scrutinized by Frank and everyone else who seemed to think they had a claim on her success. The turning point came one fateful evening when Lena discovered that Nora had been making financial decisions on Lena's behalf without her knowledge. She had set up a meeting with an investment advisor, one that Lena had never authorized, and had made changes to Lena's trust fund, directing funds to investments that seemed suspiciously risky. When Lena confronted her, Nora's response was cold and calculating. She claimed that she was only doing what was best for Lena, that Lena was too overwhelmed to make the right decisions on her own. It was a slap in the face, a cruel reminder of how easily people could exploit her kindness and vulnerability. But the worst part was that Nora's actions weren't just financially dangerous, they were emotionally manipulative. Every time Lena tried to distance herself, Nora would twist the situation, making Lena feel guilty for not trusting her. She reminded Lena of all the times they had been there for each other growing up, of the bond they shared. Nora would spin her web, making Lena feel like the bad guy for questioning her motives. Lena felt like she was losing control of everything: her money, her relationships, and even her own mind. While all of this was unfolding, Lena was still trying to hold on to some semblance of normalcy for her children. They were the one part of her life that still felt untouched by the chaos, and Lena was determined to keep it that way. But even her relationship with them was starting to feel strained. Her focus was divided, her mind constantly preoccupied with the mounting pressure from Frank and Nora. Her children, too young to fully understand what was happening, could sense that something was wrong. They had started to act out, becoming more difficult to manage. The once peaceful home Lena had built now felt like a battleground, and Lena was unsure how much longer she could hold everything together. But just when Lena thought things couldn't get worse, they did. One day, as she was going through some paperwork, Lena discovered something that shook her to the core. Hidden among the stacks of financial documents was a letter from Frank's lawyer. The letter was a formal request for a full custody hearing, but it wasn't just about custody anymore. Frank had found a way to use Lena's newfound wealth against her. He was claiming that her sudden windfall had made her an unfit mother, that she was incapable of managing both the money and her children's well-being. The realization hit Lena like a ton of bricks. Frank wasn't just after her money, he was after everything. He wanted to take her children, to take control of her life, and he was using her wealth as the tool to do it. It was a brutal, calculated move. He knew exactly what he was doing, and now, he had the legal backing to make it happen. The battle for custody was about to begin, and Lena was no longer sure she could win. Every time she tried to fight back, every time she tried to protect herself and her children, the walls seemed to close in tighter. Nora, too, had become a constant, lurking presence in the background, offering to help but only serving to complicate things further. Lena was exhausted, emotionally drained, and utterly defeated. The weight of the situation was crushing, and the realization that she had no one left to turn to hit harder than anything else. The friends she had trusted, the family members who had supported her, none of them seemed to understand the depth of her struggle. They saw the money, but not the chaos that had come with it. Lena had become a prisoner of her own success, trapped in a game she never asked to play. With her children's future hanging in the balance, Lena had no choice but to prepare for the battle ahead. But little did she know, the fight for her family was only the beginning. There were darker forces at play, and as Lena would soon find out, the people closest to her weren't just after her wealth, they were willing to destroy everything she held dear to claim it. The battle for Lena's children had begun, and the fight was more vicious than she could have ever imagined. The court proceedings were grueling, each day bringing new evidence, new accusations, and a constant barrage of legal tactics from Frank's side. He was relentless, using every angle to undermine Lena's ability to care for their children, all while positioning himself as the more stable, responsible parent. The accusations weren't just about her ability to raise them, they were about her fitness as a mother. Frank, with his history of manipulation, had successfully spun the narrative that Lena's sudden wealth had made her unfit to care for their kids, claiming that the distractions of money and fame had clouded her judgment. For Lena, the courtroom was a battlefield she never expected to be on. Every day she faced a relentless cross-examination that chipped away at her self-confidence. She had always been a good mother, doing her best to provide for her children, but now, the very things she had worked so hard to protect were being used against her. The weight of the fight, combined with her increasingly fractured personal relationships, was taking its toll. Her anxiety grew, her nights filled with sleepless thoughts about losing her children, about being stripped of everything she had worked for. The world outside the courtroom, once filled with excitement and the promise of a new beginning, now felt like an oppressive force, closing in on her from all sides. As the legal battle raged on, Nora's behavior grew even more erratic. Lena had tried to distance herself from her old friend, but Nora had made it clear that she wasn't going to let go so easily. Every phone call, every visit carried an unspoken pressure. Nora had been with her through thick and thin, but Lena could no longer ignore the unsettling feeling that had been building. It wasn't just that Nora had crossed boundaries by managing Lena's finances, it was that she seemed to be manipulating every aspect of Lena's life, including her emotions. Nora had once been the quiet, dependable friend, but now she was a shadowy figure in Lena's life, pulling strings behind the scenes. Lena had never been good at confronting people, especially someone she had trusted for so long. But the situation had reached a breaking point. Nora's constant presence, her incessant suggestions, and her attempts to involve herself in every decision had become too much. Lena realized that Nora wasn't just looking to help her, she was positioning herself as an essential part of Lena's life, a person who had to be included in every major decision. As the custody battle with Frank intensified, Lena felt herself becoming more isolated. Nora wasn't just a friend anymore, she was a co-conspirator in a game that Lena had never agreed to play. She wasn't sure what Nora's true intentions were, but the lines between help and manipulation had become dangerously blurred. Then, just when Lena thought things couldn't get worse, they did. The discovery came out of nowhere, a shocking betrayal that shattered everything. Lena had always been careful with her finances, but she had let her guard down with Nora. After all, Nora had been there for her when she needed support most, or so Lena had thought. It turned out that Nora had been siphoning money from Lena's accounts. Not a lot at once, but enough to go unnoticed until now. The transactions were subtle, almost imperceptible, but when Lena looked closer, she found that Nora had transferred hundreds of thousands of dollars into accounts under her own name. It wasn't just a few withdrawals, it was a calculated series of thefts, taking advantage of Lena's trust to enrich herself. The realization hit Lena like a punch to the gut. Nora, the one person who had been by her side through everything, had been stealing from her all along. The betrayal was so deep, so personal, that Lena didn't know how to process it. She had been used not just by Frank, but by someone she had considered her closest confidante. Nora had manipulated her at every turn, offering advice that only benefited her and putting Lena in a position where she was forced to trust her. It wasn't just the money that stung, it was the loss of someone Lena thought she could trust, someone who had been like family. The discovery of Nora's betrayal pushed Lena to the brink. The court case was already draining her, but now, with this new betrayal, Lena was consumed by a sense of hopelessness. The people she had relied on had turned on her, each with their own agenda, each seeking a piece of the prize she had won. The sense of isolation grew, and for the first time since the lottery win, Lena began to question everything. What had she gained? Was the money worth all the pain, all the destruction it had caused in her life? But Lena wasn't one to back down, not entirely. As the court battle continued, she began to fight back with renewed determination. She hired a new lawyer, someone she could trust completely, to take on Frank's lawyer and expose the lies he had spread about her. She started gathering evidence of Frank's manipulation, his attempts to use their children as pawns. Lena's fight was far from over. The court case was still in progress, and the damage from Nora's actions was only beginning to surface. But as Lena stood at the crossroads of her future, she knew she couldn't let the people who had used her control her any longer. Her children were her priority, and she would fight with everything she had to keep them safe, to prove that she was the better parent, despite everything that had happened. In the end, Lena would learn a painful truth. The true cost of her lottery win was more than just the money, it was the people who had used her, the trust that had been broken, and the emotional toll it had taken on her and her family. But it was also a lesson in strength. The battle wasn't over, and the road ahead would be filled with more challenges, but Lena was ready to face whatever came her way. Her story was far from finished, and she would stop at nothing to reclaim the life she had worked so hard to build. Thank you for watching Mystery Minds. This case is a stark reminder of how greed and obsession can destroy lives. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more chilling true crime tales. Join us next time as we continue to explore the darker side of the human psyche. Until then, stay curious, stay safe, and keep your mind sharp. This has been the story of Lottery Win Turns Deadly.